Yeah. Over the last couple of hours, the Russian military has been conducting a massive missile and drone strikes across the entire territory of Ukraine. This is purely an impression on my part. It might not be exactly true statistically, but I get the sense that this is the biggest missile and drone strike that the Russians have conducted in the entire conflict up to now, extending all the way back to the start of the military part of the conflict in February 2022. President Zelensky himself says that over 100 Russian missiles and 100 drones were operating over Ukraine over the course of early this morning, and that might in fact be an underestimate. The other thing to say is that a significant part of this operation appears to have taken place during daylight. And again, this is a departure from Russian practice when conducting these kind of missile and drone strikes at an earlier period during the war. In fact, all Russian missile and drone strikes in the autumn of 2022 and the winter and early spring of 2023 took place at night. Some of these missile and drone attacks which took place whilst it was still dark, but a fair number of them appear to have happened in daylight. And the result is that we're able to see lots of pictures of missiles and drones. Well, I can't tell the difference myself. I'm not able to study or understand these pictures particularly well because of my well-known vision issues. Anyway, some of these pictures have shown these attacks unfolding during the day, and there's images of plumes of smoke rising over many different locations across Ukraine. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry has provided early this morning its account of what these missile and drone strikes were all about, and I'm going to read what the Russian Defense Ministry says. Today in the morning, the armed forces of the Russian Federation delivered a group strike by long-range air and sea-based precision weaponry, as well as operational tactical aviation of the Russian armed forces, attack armed unmanned aerial vehicles, drones in other words, at the critical power infrastructure of Ukraine's defense industry. Strikes were delivered at power substations in Kiev, Vinnytsia, Zhytomyr, Khmelnytsky, Dnipropetrovsk, that's Dnipro, according to the Ukrainians, Poltava, Nikolaev, Kirovograd, and Odessa. Compressor stations supporting operations of the Ukrainian gas transportation system were hit in Lvov, Ivano-Frankovsk, and Kharkiv regions. Moreover, strikes were delivered at the depots of aircraft armament supplied to the Kiev regime by Western countries at airfields in Kiev and Dnipropetrovsk. All the assigned targets have been destroyed, resulting in power outages and disruption of railway transportation of arms and ammunition to the line of contact. So that's what the Russian Defense Ministry is telling us about this attack, that it was primarily directed or targeted the energy system, though they do accept that other parts of the other facilities in Ukraine were attacked. Also, they talk about depots where equipment, missiles and such things for the Ukrainian forces were located, and perhaps other facilities as well. There is a rumour floating on the internet, and I want to stress this is purely a rumour, which is that on the strength of some photographs that the Ukrainians rather unwisely published showing the widow of a Ukrainian pilot being shown around an F-16 somewhere in Ukraine. That on the strength of those photographs, it was possible to geolocate the presence of the F-16s and the F-16 in question, and that this was in a facility near the town of Ivano-Frankovsk. And, well, if you were listening carefully, you would have noticed that Ivano-Frankovsk was one of the towns which the Russian Defense Ministry says has been attacked. Now, I want to stress, I don't know that the Russians were, in fact, targeting the F-16s. The Russian Defense Ministry has not said any such thing. And, of course, as to those photographs showing the purported whereabouts of the F-16s, we don't know exactly when those pictures were made. They might have been made a week ago, for example, and it's entirely possible that the aircraft were moved to a different location before the strike took place. So let's not jump to any conclusions. But we can summarize some other things. The first is that the missile strikes which took place right across Ukraine, including Kiev itself, on a simply enormous scale, appear to have happened in the absence of any activity of any substantial sort on the part of Ukraine's once extremely effective air defense system. If we're talking about land-based surface-to-air missiles, Patriots and S-300s and IRIS-Ts and NASAMs and all that sort of thing, they didn't seem to be very active last night and early this morning, which is presumably why we're able to see all these Russian missiles flitting across the landscape without much sign that they're suffering much risk of interception or damage. Now, the Western powers have been moving heaven and earth ever since the spring of last year to build up Ukraine's air defense system. Based on the film and pictures that I've seen today, those efforts do not appear to have been particularly successful. No doubt there are still Patriot missile launchers in Ukraine, and NASAMS launchers and IRIS-Ts and some S-300s and Buk systems as well. But it looks as if the gaps in the coverage are now so great that the Russians are able to bypass them. The Russian Defense Ministry report also speaks about land and sea-based systems being used. It could be that the sea-based systems refer to Kalibr missiles, which are subsonic, but of course it's also possible that Zircon hypersonic missiles were used as well, launched from submarines of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. We'll just have to wait and see. And there are ample reports that MiG-31 fighter jets have been operating, launching hypersonic Kinzhal missiles against targets in Ukraine. And in fact, there's even a report that having taken off from the airfields and launched their Kinzhals, the MiG-31s returned to the airfields, were refueled, re-equipped with more Kinzhals, took off again and launched even more. So that perhaps gives us a sense of the level and intensity of the strike that was being carried out. And, well, there's also the question of the extent of the damage that has been done. Undoubtedly, there have been major blackouts across Ukraine. That is indisputable. We could see the effect of that. Industrial facilities and military facilities have no doubt been destroyed, but it's going to take some time to get, I think, a sense of the overall damage that has been inflicted by these Russian missile strikes on Ukraine. Now, one little detail that I did notice was that there've been lots of bloggers providing reports of particular places in Ukraine which have been targeted by the Russians over the course of this missile and drone strike. I think one always needs to handle these reports with a certain level of care. They all come from unofficial sources. What they do show in this case is the sheer breadth of the strikes, the huge territory that was covered by these strikes. But for what it's worth, one of these reports identified one target as the airbase near Kiev, where it is known that Patriot missile launchers are located. And it could be that the Russians were again attacking or targeting some of these Patriot missile launchers on the assumption, of course, that they are still there. Now, there's a number of further points to say. I said that the Ukrainian air defense system appears to be, in effect, in a state of collapse. There are apparently some air defense systems still functioning around Kiev, though Kiev was a heavy target of the Russian missile and drone strikes last night and early this morning. But overall, as I said, the air defense system seems to be most striking by its relative absence, based so far on the films that we have seen. The Ukrainians, of course, have not yet provided us with the number of missiles and drones that they're undoubtedly going to claim that they shot down. But anyway, let's just make a few observations about this. There's been lots of claims that one of the reasons why Ukraine is so exposed now to Russian drone and missile strikes is because most of the air defense systems have been redeployed to Sumy region, where they are trying to defend, or rather to provide air cover for the Ukrainian forces operating in Russia's Kursk region. Now, to some extent, this is undoubtedly true. Early on in the course of the Ukrainian offensive in Kursk, in the first couple of days, the Russians reported that they destroyed 3 Patriot missile launchers and a Patriot radar system in the Kursk area, and they also destroyed 3 Buk M3 Soviet-era tracked surface-to-air missile launch vehicles, which, by the way, and for the record, almost certainly launch American missiles, American Standard missiles. Several air defense systems, Ukrainian air defense systems, have undoubtedly been redeployed to Sumy region, and some of them, of course, have already been destroyed by the Russians. The Russians have also destroyed an IRIS-T system, apparently somewhere in this general area too, and they provided, or at least we have had film of the Russians destroying a Krotal and a Tunguska point defense systems. These are vehicles which are short, have air defense missiles which are short range, but which provide specific protection for important installations. Anyway, there are, in other words, some air defense systems in Sumy region providing the Ukrainians with air cover there. But I think that focusing on the Kursk offensive to explain the apparent lack of Ukrainian air defense systems across Ukraine perhaps disregards the immense damage that the Russians did to Ukraine's air defense system over the course of a long campaign that the Russian missile and air forces conducted in the spring of this year, when they were quite obviously hunting Ukrainian air defense assets and destroying them. I remember that the Russians released pictures of successive destruction of Patriot air defense systems all across Ukraine, including, by the way, in the Avdiivka area, and other systems, NASAMS and IRIS-Ts were being destroyed at that and S-300s were being destroyed at that same time. And to my knowledge, so far, despite various promises from the West has not provided replacements for these destroyed systems. There are reports that the West, or rather the West has said, Western countries at various times said that they will provide replacements, but so far none have done so. And over the last couple of weeks, there have been some reports that Germany in particular has exhausted its ability to continue to provide replacement Patriot systems to make up for those which have been destroyed. So that probably is a bigger explanation, a better explanation of why the Ukrainian air defense system over the course of this strike appears to have been so invisible. It's not that air defense assets have been moved en masse to Sumy region to support the offensive in Kursk. It is because the number of air defense systems that Ukraine possesses is now relatively few and far between, and that years of Russian attrition attacks have gradually ground it down to the point where it is no longer capable of withstanding Russian attacks anymore. Now, one of the narratives that we have heard extensively is that the F-16s, when they go into operation, it seems so far that they're not in operation, are going to be used in place of land-based air defense systems to try to shoot down Russian cruise missiles. And that might start to happen at some point in the next few months. It's likely that the F-16s will to some extent be able to do this. But it's important to say that it's most unlikely that the F-16s can handle Russian ballistic missiles like the Iskander-M, or Russian hypersonic missiles like the Kinzhal and the Zircon, or that they can handle other Russian missiles like the Kh-69, which is subsonic but very stealthy and operates close to the ground. They probably can, however, shoot down Kh-101s and Kalibr missiles, which still, from what I can tell, constitute the bulk of the missiles that the Russians are launching at Ukraine. But that's not going to happen for some weeks or months, not until the F-16s are ready. The number of F-16s at the moment is few, and that's ignoring the possibility that some of them might have been destroyed last night or this morning. But of course, even when they are operating, the very fact that they're operating, trying to shoot Russian missiles down, will expose them as potential targets. And we know that the Russians have air defense missiles of their own and very long-range air-to-air missiles like the S-400s and the R-37Ms. And at that point, it's likely that the F-16s will themselves, even as they're trying to hunt Russian cruise missiles are going to become themselves hunted. So that's a dramatic situation, which is probably still some weeks away. It's one we perhaps need to keep an eye out for and look out for. In the meantime, it looks as if the Russians, until that happens, are able to hit targets across Ukraine at will. Now, why last night and this morning? A couple of days ago, we were hearing lots of predictions that the Russians were going to launch a massive missile strike on Ukraine to coincide with Ukraine's Independence Day, which is the 24th of August. Today is actually the 26th of August, so 2 days after those celebrations. Why is the attack happening now on the 26th of August and not on the 24th of August? Some are suggesting that the Russians were being very considerate to the Ukrainians. They were allowing the Ukrainians to celebrate their Independence Day, and then only after the celebrations were over, out of some strange humanitarian logic, that was when the Russians launched their attack. I don't think this is plausible at all. I think the Russians have been stockpiling missiles for several weeks now. We know that production of missiles, of these sort of missiles, has risen significantly in Russia. But the Russians did use up a lot of missiles over the course of the spring, hunting Ukrainian air defense systems, attacking the Ukrainian energy system, inflicting massive damage on Ukrainian infrastructure altogether. Anyway, I think the Russians have been busy stockpiling, making up for all of those losses. The fact that they've now resumed the missile war suggests to me that they feel that they have their arsenal now once again full. And it probably is also the case that this missile strike is intended to complement a major Russian offensive taking place on the ground. To repeat, just a couple of days ago, I think it was 3 days ago, Vladimir Putin met with his top generals, with Gerasimov and Rudskoy, and spoke with all the commanders of the various group of forces, and probably spoke to the commander of the land forces and the air forces and all of those people at some undisclosed location. It looked very much like a council of war, though unsurprisingly the Kremlin has not provided us with a very detailed readout. But anyway, it looked like a council of war, and I suggest that almost certainly it was a council of war. That with events in Pokrovsk and Toretsk and Chasiv Yar now developing very fast, the Russians are now preparing for what might be the knockout blow. And the attack on the Ukrainian energy and air defense facilities and the military-industrial complex looks to me as if it is correlated in some way with the prospects of that specific offensive. Note, for example, that the Russian Defense Ministry says that all the assigned targets have been destroyed, resulting in power outages and disruption of railway transportation of arms and ammunition to the line of contact. Now, why would the Russians want to disrupt the transportation of arms and ammunition to the line of contact in this particular way at this particular time? Well, it looks to me as if they're acting to deplete Ukrainian logistical supplies and perhaps movement of reinforcements on the eve of their own forthcoming offensive. Anyway, that is how it looks to me. Now, it may be that there's other things going on that I don't understand. I'm not going to pretend that I'm the absolute expert on these matters, But anyway, that is my own reading of the situation as of today. One way or the other, we've seen a massive missile and drone strike across Ukraine. We don't know, by the way, whether it's even over. We don't know whether the Russians might be planning more of these strikes over the course of tomorrow night, or perhaps over the course of the next few weeks. Maybe the Russians, this is a standalone strike, or maybe, which is perhaps more likely, it's the first big salvo in a longer range campaign, which is due to take place over several weeks and months. When the Russians do launch these kind of attacks, as they have before, I've noticed that they like to start with a big attack like this, with hundreds or at least scores of missiles launched on a particular day. That deals huge damage right across the Ukrainian military system and energy system. And then further strikes take place over the course of the next few days and weeks and months. But the purpose then is basically to supplement the damage that was done by the initial strike, and not to provide the Ukrainians to conduct significant repairs. Anyway, that's my own understanding of the situation. Maybe, as I said, there's more to this than I'm aware of. I'm not sure what that would be. But anyway, that's how I see these things at the moment. Anyway, let's now turn to the military situation on the front lines, because, of course, this is ultimately what is driving events. And if there's going to be a big Russian offensive, it will probably, or no doubt, be intended to capitalize on this offensive that the Russians have been conducting now for several months, and which has been underway basically since the end of Ukraine's own offensive last October, almost a year from now. So what has been happening? Well, yesterday, over the course of my program, I discussed at some length the fact that the Russians appear to have conducted a major offensive on Novogrodivka, that they appear to be in the process of capturing the town of Novogrodivka, and that Novogrodivka is a much bigger place than I had appreciated when I was doing some of my previous programs. And I think that remains the case. The interesting fact about the situation in Novogrodivka, however, is that the Russian advance on Novogrodivka not only continues, but it is continuing extremely fast. A number of Russian commentators have made the point that Novogrodivka is being captured by the Russians practically undamaged. There is very little footage which shows the kind of physical devastation in Novogrodivka that we become used to from other cities that have been fought over previously in this war. Places like Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Toretsk now, or wherever. This time it looks as if the fight for Novogrodivka is being conducted, well, I won't say unopposed, but it does seem as if Ukrainian opposition this time is much weaker than we have ever seen. And, well, mappers have provided us with their different takes of where the Russians now are within Novogrodivka. And it seems to me that they're all basically telling, with some nuances, the same story, which is that the Russians now control roughly 50 or perhaps even 60% of Novogrodivka. Novogrodivka looks as if it has been, well, I won't say largely captured by the Russians. There's still clearly some fighting still to do, but that the Russians seem to be very close to capturing a substantial part of this particular town. And it looks as if the Russians have not just captured Novogrodivka itself, but it looks as if they're also close to capturing various other positions in and around Novogrodivka and the nearby town of Selidovo. Now, I talked yesterday about the fact that the Russians seem to be clearing various villages around Selidovo and to the north and south of Novogrodivka and close to Selidovo itself, and that seems to be indisputably true. The Russians do seem to be largely in control now of these places, but pictures apparently are now appearing of the Russians in control of a slag heap near the village of Mikhailovka, which is, by the way, from the picture that I've seen, an enormous slag heap. It towers over the landscape, and apparently it provides perfect observation of the whole of Selidovo as well. I've discussed this before, but it looks as if Ukrainian defences around Novogrodivka and Selidovo are extremely half-hearted, that the Ukrainians don't seem to be able to establish proper positions, defence positions, in either of these two towns, and it looks as if the Russians are going to capture Novogrodivka, town of 17,000 people, within perhaps a week of fighting, and perhaps it will take them even less time to capture Selidovo itself. With those two places securely under Russian control, with Grodivka, which may, by the way, have already fallen, also under their control, it doesn't seem as if there's anything that can hold the Russians back from an attack on Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, and I get the sense that the defences for that town are as fragile as those for Novogrodivka and Selidovo itself. Now, I said that this meeting of Putin with these Russian generals, with Gerasimov and Rudskoy and the others, looked like a council of war. I wonder whether what Putin was discussing with the generals is what the next stage of this operation is going to be once Pokrovsk, Selidovo and Novogrodivka have all been captured. Bear in mind that the Russians appear to have captured most of Krasnogorovka. It's just these two parts of these two streets. The Russians are advancing along these streets as well that project out of Krasnogorovka that they still have to capture. So, a whole cluster of small towns and one largest town, Pokrovsk, are all about to fall. These lie directly on the main highway, supply highway for the Ukrainian forces eastwards towards Konstantinovka and Chasiv Yar. So it's perhaps understandable that with signs that this whole cluster of important towns are about to be captured by the Russians, that Putin would want to know what plans the general staff and the Russian commanders have to exploit this significant victory. And, well, I talked about this cluster of towns in western Donbass. There's also reports that further south, the Russians have made further advances in the village of Konstantinovka. I've seen a map, and that map suggests to me that the Russians now are in control of roughly half of Konstantinovka, perhaps even more of it, and that the Russians not only are now well beyond the supply road between Konstantinovka and Vuhledar, but that Russian forces have been moving closer to Vuhledar itself, perhaps preparing for a further assault on this heavily fortified and fiercely defended town, which is the linchpin of the Ukrainian defences in southern Donbass. So, on the assumption that all of these places are going to be captured by the Russians fairly soon, it's understandable that Putin would want to know what the Russian Defense Ministry, what the General Staff are now proposing to do. Are they going to move west towards Pavlograd and Dnipro? Are they going to focus instead on finishing off Ukrainian defences in the Ukrainian forces further east in Donbass? Or are they strong enough to do both at the same time? Anyway, that is one interesting story, one interesting battle that is to come. And as I said, to repeat a point that I made, the missile strike that we've just been discussing, I'm sure is connected with these events. So that's the situation briefly. Pokrovsk, Selidovo, Novogrodivka. There's much more news also from Toretsk. And again, this is an area where it's been surprising how weak the Ukrainian defences have been. The Ukrainians fortified Toretsk intensely. It was supposed to be one of the most heavily defended positions along the entire line of contact. We've now had more film apparently confirming Russian control of the two coal mines south of Toretsk and their land and their slag heaps. The Russians, of course, control the whole of New York. There are some claims, which I find impossible to judge, that there are some Ukrainian troops encircled by the Russians in a factory area that's part of the New York, of the town of New York. There's also reports, by the way, just to say, New York also a significantly bigger place than I'd assumed, place with population of over 10,000, not the village that I had imagined it at one time to be. But anyway, supposedly there might still be some Ukrainian troops holding out in some of the factories around New York, but that they're all apparently surrounded. There's also rumours that there are Ukrainian troops surrounded in another industrial area connected to the village of Zalizny. It seems that in neither case is there any prospect of these Ukrainian troops being relieved. All of this may be true, but the big battle now is happening inside Toretsk itself. There were reports this morning that the Russians are on the brink of capturing the village of Druzhba to the northeast of Toretsk, that they're now breaking through from the east and the south into central Toretsk, and there are also pictures of Russian drones destroying Ukrainian tanks in northwestern Toretsk. Now, some distance from where one would expect the Russians to be, but maybe the Russians again are advancing further and faster and deeper than many commentators are assuming, because why would a Ukrainian tank be there apparently conducting combat operations? It wasn't just trundling towards the battlefronts from what I could see. Why would the Ukrainian tank be there? The tank which the Russians attacked and maybe destroyed, or at least disabled, if there weren't Russian troops in that area as well. Just saying. But, maybe I'm getting this wrong. Maybe things are more complicated than I assume. Or maybe I'm just misreading the film. I'm not the best person, as I've said many times, to understand films. Now, I noticed that the various mapping projects have now adjusted their readings about the presence of the Russians in Chasiv Yar. There's been a claim made by various parties over the last couple of weeks that the Russians have paused in Chasiv Yar. The Ukrainians themselves, by the way, have been saying no such thing. The Ukrainian troops who've been contacted by media outlets like the New York Times have been saying that the pressure on them by the Russians in Chasiv Yar is as intense as ever. I have no reason to doubt that at all, by the way. Anyway, that's what the Ukrainians have been saying. And in fact, exactly as I'd anticipated, the latest map readings show that very significant part of Chasiv Yar, west of the aqueduct, is now under Russian control. From what I could see, the Russians now control perhaps 40% of the central part of this town. They seem to be pushing the Ukrainians back quite rapidly. There are outlying districts of Chasiv Yar which the Russians will still have to fight for once the central part of Chasiv Yar falls under their control. But I'm guessing that that isn't going to take very long, that once these places are isolated from each other, then it will be possible for the Russians to move quite quickly and clear up the rest of Chasiv Yar, and then they will have the high ground and they'll be able to look down on the city of Konstantinovka and shell it from high ground, if you like. And if Toretsk has fallen, as it will, almost certainly at some point within the next few days, and if weeks maybe, and if Pokrovsk also falls and the main supply road is also cut, then the Russians could potentially attack Konstantinovka, a town of about 70,000 people before the war, from multiple directions. And again, no doubt Putin will want to know whether that is the General Staff's plan, whether that is what they intend to do and how precisely they intend to go about doing it. I would say all of that. Of course, Putin will already have known the general outlines of the General Staff's plan, but any plan has to adapt and change and shift as the situation evolves, and Putin obviously will want to know whether there's been any modifications done to the details and, by the way, to the timetable in light of recent events. And lastly, there's been some more news apparently from the Siversk area. The Russians, a couple of days ago, captured the railway station at Vimka. They apparently have now reached the village of Vimka itself, which is presumably close to the railway station. It seems once they capture Vimka, Siversk itself will be within eyesight of the advanced forces of the Russians, who are also apparently attacking other places around Siversk as their forces gradually converge on this town. Anyway, that's the situation on the Donbass battlefields, the main situation on the Donbass battlefields. The major focus at the moment, as I said, is on Novogrodivka and Selidovo, Toretsk as well, but one shouldn't perhaps neglect what's also going on in places like Vuhledar and Siversk. It's likely that these two places will fall or be attacked fairly soon. It could be that at some point in the autumn, both of these places will also fall, and that the Battle of Donbass will be reaching its end point. Perhaps also by that point, the Russians will be on the Dnieper too, though I'm not going to try and guess and speculate too far ahead. Anyway, that's Donbass. That's the Russian offensive. What about the other part of the battle that's playing out in Kursk region, which is the battle that continues to attract the most attention? One of the reasons why the Battle of Kursk is attracting so much attention internationally is obviously because it is taking place in the territory of pre-2014 Russia, though, as I have said many times, as far as the Russian authorities are concerned, legally speaking, Donbass, Crimea, all of these places are as much Russian as Kursk itself is. Another reason, however, I suspect why the events in Kursk are attracting the attention that they are, is because of a perception that still persists that it is the Ukrainians who are still on the offensive in Kursk region. But I'm beginning to wonder whether that is really the case anymore. Anyway, we've had various accounts of the situation in Kursk region, and I'm going to start again with a report from Group of Forces North. And they say this: fierce fighting for the settlement of Malaya Lochnia continues. The arrival of reinforcements of 8 Black Sea Marines allowed the enemy to be driven from the outskirts of the settlement and to repel new waves of attacks. Up to 30 enemy soldiers and 4 armoured vehicles were destroyed in 24 hours. The village is under the control of Russian troops. The enemy attacks the villages of Cherkaskoye, Porechnoye and Echayev with large forces. Over the course of the last 24 hours, we repelled 2 attacks with a total of up to 60 enemy troops and 7 armoured fighting vehicles. During the repulse of these attacks, up to 25 enemy troops were killed and 4 armoured vehicles were burned. In the direction of Korenovo, attacks on the workers' settlement of the same name and the settlement of Komarovka were repelled. Up to 20 Ukrainian troops and 2 armoured vehicles were destroyed. An enemy sabotage and reconnaissance group was discovered and destroyed by artillery fire near the settlement of Kremyanoye. In the south of the Sudzhansky district, we have launched a counterattack and are destroying the enemy in the area of the village of Cherkaskaya, Konopyelka. And then they say that over the course of the last 24 hours, enemy losses in Kharkiv and Kursk and Sumy areas amounted to 460 men, of whom 370 were in the Sumy area. And then they make this rather interesting point. The village of Malaya Lochnia is like a bone in the throat of the Ukrainian armed forces. They have lost so many personnel and equipment there that it is impossible to count them, and the Ukrainian armed forces have to send units of almost the 3rd echelon there. The fighting continues around the clock, and we are withstanding the enemy's assault with honour. Then they say that they've also repelled an attempt by the Ukrainians to breach the border in Belgorod region, and they say that whether the enemy is planning a breakthrough in Belgorod or distracting our troops is a separate question, but one thing is certain: in either case the enemy will get a punch in the teeth. And then there's the mandatory quote, and it's from Sun Tzu: war loves victory and hates duration, which, by the way, is a double-edged thing. Could be said in criticism of the way the Russians have conducted this war in its totality as well. But anyway, there we are. That's what Group of Forces North are saying. And before I analyse it in more detail, I think it's worthwhile going to what the Russian Defense Ministry says about the situation in Kursk region as well, because they also have their account of the battle in Kursk region. It's less detailed than the one provided by Group of Forces North, but it complements it. They say that units of the Group of Forces North repelled attacks launched by enemy assault detachments in the direction of Kremennoye, Malaya Lochnia and Nechayev, as well as thwarted attempts to launch attacks in the directions of Komarovka, Spalnoye, Korenevo, Pogrebki and Olgovka. And they then also say that they have destroyed, they've neutralized enemy reconnaissance, sabotage and reconnaissance groups in forest belts attempting to get into Russian territory. And they are putting Ukrainian losses over the last 24 hours at over 400 men killed or wounded, higher than Group of Forces North, including 27 units of armour, including 1 tank and 2 infantry fighting vehicles and 3 armoured personnel carriers. The armoured complement is falling. The Ukrainian armoured forces are reducing in size on this battlefront, almost certainly as a result of the very heavy losses. Now, these two reports are very interesting. The first thing to say is that, again, we see that the fighting is concentrated on the same places that we've become used to over a long time. Korenevo, Malaya Lochnia, the areas around Suja, places like this. There's no reference in this report to Ruskaya Porechnoye and Cherkasskaya Porechnoye, but again, a glance at the map strongly suggests that Malaya Lochnia, whilst Malaya Lochnia remains under Russian control, the Ukrainians aren't really able to break through to these two villages, and that their various attacks on Martinovka, which is on the main road from Suja, and they have continued to conduct apparently attacks towards Martinovka, that their attacks in these places are not very effective. So, what's interesting about Malaya Lochnia? First of all, there were many reports that the Ukrainians captured this village. In fact, some mapping projects until fairly recently have been showing Malaya Lochnia under Ukrainian control. About a week ago, Redovka said that the Russians had recaptured it. And clearly that is true. Group of Forces North say that the Russians do indeed control Malaya Lochnia. They also say that it is a place that the Ukrainians have made frantic attempts to capture or recapture, all of which have been unsuccessful. Now, other reports, which probably are correct in light of what Group of Forces North has been saying, other reports say that a group of Russian troops, a unit of Russian troops that had captured Malaya Lochnia had been encircled, and that the Ukrainians, in their various attacks on Malaya Lochnia, have been attacking what was in effect an isolated, surrounded Russian garrison. That might suggest that the Ukrainians never, in fact, had control of Malaya Lochnia, that this was a village where Russian troops were located, stationed, and where they stood firm, and that this provided the block that prevented further Ukrainian advances north of Suja. Just saying. And the latest reports from Group of Forces North, but also from other Russian reporting projects and bloggers now suggest that this encirclement of Malaya Loknia has been broken and that the Russians have now managed to relieve their forces in Malaya Loknia and that this village is now firmly under Russian control. We've had similar confusing information further west about Korenovo. There were several claims that the Ukrainians had captured the village of Korenovo. Group of Forces North refers to a workers' settlement apparently located close to Korenovo, which is also called Korenovo. I wonder whether that was the place which the Ukrainians captured and that people confused that workers' settlement with the village. Now, there's been a rather dramatic report from Group of Forces North, which speaks of Russian forces having advanced and recaptured a settlement which appears to be the workers' settlement of Korenovo, and finding lots of evidence that Russian civilians were killed in cold blood by the Ukrainians there. Now, as is my invariable practice, I'm not going to discuss the truth or falsity of those claims. That would require an independent investigation, which of course will never happen. The point is that it looks as if the Russians are advancing in this area, also that they're starting to push the Ukrainians back. And Group of Forces North themselves say that they're counterattacking towards a village called Cherkasskaya Konopielka, which I assume is somehow connected to the village of Ruskaya Konopielka, which is located quite close and to the west of Suja. And if so, it looks as if Group of Forces North is now starting an advance towards Suja itself. I was rather skeptical about that possibility in my video yesterday, but it could be that that is the information that Group of Forces North is giving us. Now, all of this, of course, depends very much on putting together pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Neither the Russian Defense Ministry nor Group of Forces North are giving us very secure information. It's a fact which perhaps needs to be said. But anyway, that's how the situation looks to me. Now, that takes us back to that meeting between Putin and Gerasimov and the other commanders, because the very brief Kremlin readout spoke about Putin receiving a briefing about efforts being made to counter the enemy forces that invaded the Kursk region and measures taken to destroy them. So maybe, just possibly, something is happening, that there's an attempt being underway, that the Russian forces are making an attempt to capture the general situation, to push the Ukrainians back out of Kursk region. Maybe some kind of Russian counteroffensive in Kursk region is now underway. Group of Forces North, of course, also provided its usual update about the fighting in Volchansk and Lipsy. It's clear that their pressure there has not reduced. They continue to advance, according to them, in Volchansk, and they continue to hold back the Ukrainians in Lipsy. In the meantime, the Kremlin has now published another report about Putin having discussions with military officers. And it says this is a report that has came out from the Kremlin yesterday afternoon. The president was briefed, that's to say Putin, on the situation along the line of contact. Last Saturday night, Vladimir Putin heard reports from commanders performing combat tasks in the areas bordering on Ukraine. And we're told that commander of the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade of the Black Sea Fleet, commander of the 115th Naval Infantry Brigade of the Pacific Fleet, commander of the Detached Airborne Assault Brigade, commander of the 56th Airborne Assault Regiment, and commander of the 51st Airborne Assault Regiment updated the Supreme Commander-in-Chief on the situation along the line of contact and went on to present their proposals regarding further developments as approved by the command headquarters of the corresponding military groups within their respective areas of responsibility. Now, the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade and the 115th Naval Infantry Brigade are located in Kursk region. I don't know about these paratroop forces that Putin also spoke to, but it could be that they're located in Kursk region as well, in which case the possibility that a counterattack in Kursk region is being prepared should not be discounted. These are significant forces and they're elite forces as well. And in my experience, it is unusual for Putin to take briefings directly from unit commanders. He usually contacts forces, or at least the Kremlin tells us about it, when he speaks with the group of forces command, not with troops from the individual units. So it looks to me as if Putin wanted to hear from the military unit commanders on location in Kursk region about what it is exactly that they're intending to do. Anyway, there we go. That's the situation in Ukraine today. A colossal Russian missile strike. Russian advances right across the contact line. A possible Russian counterattack now being prepared in Kursk region. We will have more clarity about all of this over the next couple of days, but my own view, to repeat again, is that a general Russian offensive of some kind is perhaps being prepared. It will probably not be a classic big arrow offensive of the sort beloved of people who write books on military history, and of the kind perhaps once practiced by the German military during the Second World War. It'll probably be much more like the kind of offensive the Russians conduct: slow, grinding, incremental, remorseless, and perhaps some would say unstoppable. But that, it seems to me, is what we're likely to continue to see over the next few months. And based on what's happening in places like Pokrovsk and Toretsk and Chasiv Yar and in other places, Ukrainian defenses are buckling and breaking down. And based on what we saw from the Russian missile strikes and drone strikes across Ukraine today, there is no Ukrainian air defense to counter them. Zelensky, by the way, continues apparently to be retreating into the world of mirages and delusions. I say that I'm not absolutely confident about this latest report that I've seen, because I've only seen it at second hand, but apparently he's given an interview to the Indian media. This is in connection with Prime Minister Modi's visit to Kiev, and he repeated all the old lines that Ukraine is not going to surrender any millimetre of its territory. It still expects to achieve victory. It still insists that on its territorial integrity, meaning its return to its 1991 borders. Based on what I've read, he apparently remains unwilling to concede on anything. His tactics now, that everything is falling apart around him, that the energy system is collapsing, that the infrastructure system is collapsing, that his army on the battlefronts in Donbass is either collapsing or in Kursk region is being bled dry. His response instead is to continue to talk about ultimate victory and try in some shape or form to drag the West into the war in the way that I discussed in my program yesterday, by getting them to help him launch missile strikes on Russian positions, crossing Russian red lines. But anyway, let's not waste more time for the moment with him. I want to discuss again and return to the topic of the situation in the Middle East, because of course this morning we had the Russian missile and drone strike on Ukraine, but this has come after the exchanges of fire between the Israelis and Hezbollah that I talked about yesterday. And I'm going to say straight away that I've now come to the conclusion that neither side is telling us the whole truth about what took place yesterday. If we believe the Israelis, they conducted a preemptive strike on the Hezbollah positions. They launched a massive airstrike with 100 aircraft. Vast numbers of Hezbollah missile and rocket installations were destroyed, but only 3 civilians were killed. Hezbollah, their leader, Nasrallah, is saying that there was no Israeli preemptive strike. They carried out their own strike. It was then that the Israelis apparently responded. The Hezbollah strike was targeted at intelligence facilities in Tel Aviv, intended to retaliate for the assassination of Fuad Shukr. Nasrallah assures us that this is not the last word on the subject, that the Hezbollah is prepared to attack again. And, well, according to the Israelis, hardly any damage was done as a result of these strikes. Only one person was killed, and that person was on an Israeli warship, and he was only killed because debris from an Israeli air defense missile which intercepted a Hezbollah rocket happened to fall on this particular warship, and this unfortunate man was struck and killed. By the way, I believe there is actual film of this incident which confirms it. In all other respects, the Hezbollah attack was apparently a complete failure. So we have reports, and by the way, I should say, Nasrallah says the same about the Israeli attack, that the Israeli attack on the Hezbollah installations was also supposedly a complete failure. Well, I've come to the conclusion that neither side is telling the complete truth. Certainly, if there was an attack with 100 aircraft, which is what the Israelis are telling us, significant amount of damage would have been done to something, be it military or civilian facilities. So I don't believe that only 3 people were killed as a result of this attack. I find that just inherently implausible. As for the Hezbollah attack on Israel, I don't know what to believe, and I'm not going to even try. Once upon a time, long ago, when I heard competing versions of events, battles in the Middle East, I always tended to go with the Israeli version. I no longer do. I say that frankly. It seems to me that the Israelis are every bit as capable of providing us with misleading information as their opponents are. I've seen too many examples of this. Maybe in a future program I will set out what they are. But anyway, I don't think either side is telling us the full truth. But in a sense, it really doesn't matter. Because one way or the other, the most important takeaway from this affair, which I discussed yesterday, is that we have had significant military action by both sides, even as the discussions to negotiate a ceasefire in Gaza are apparently at a standstill. Nasrallah, by the way, is saying that Hezbollah held back from their missile strike because they didn't want to disturb the progress of the Gaza ceasefire negotiations, something I find very difficult to believe, by the way. But anyway, regardless of whether that was so or not, the fact is that it looks as if those negotiations to achieve a ceasefire are dead in the water. So, when two sides conduct major strikes against each other, and when one side, which is Prime Minister Netanyahu and his officials, seem to be overwhelmingly focused on enlarging the war and attacking Iran, I don't think Prime Minister Netanyahu makes any secret of this. It seems to me that these two attacks that we saw yesterday, the best way to understand them is to see them for what I'm sure they were, lightning flashes in the storm that is coming, the storm that is gathering and the storm which is coming. The storm has not yet broken. It's clear that there is still pressure on Netanyahu to pull back. The Israeli army, maybe not the Air Force and the Navy, but the army are very reluctant to enlarge the war, as are Israel's intelligence agencies. On the Iranian side, I get the impression that the Iranians are far from ready yet to engage the Israelis in a long regional war. But that is where we're going. I have no doubt of it. And in my opinion, the storm at some point over the next few weeks or months is going to break. Anyway, that's what I want to discuss today. I'm not going to, this is where I'm going to end this program. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patriot and Subscribestar. Don't forget that you can also check out our shop, links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.